Hey everybody, it's Tim from Power Apps and Coffee. Welcome back. Today we're going to have a quick episode about nested for loops, something we take for granted in our normal code but behaves slightly different in Power Apps. So I thought it'd be worth a video to go over some uses, how it's put together, and some ways we can incorporate it in our future apps. All right, let's do it. Okay, so before we get into the code, let's take a look at what we're going to build today to showcase this example. So what we have that I want to show is a way to reserve equipment from an equipment list for days within a range, right? So to do that, we have a start date and end date, and as you can see here, I have a drop-down picker with a collection of items, right? Projector 1 through 3. Kids, projectors, in case you're unaware of what that is what people had to use before we could share our screens. Anyway, if we look here, we have that information just stored in a SharePoint list, right? Nice, easy data source. And what we want to do again is just pick out, I have day 1 to day 2, hit search, and we are going to take the range that we see here from start date to end date, every day in between, and the items selected in this drop-down, and within 2 loops nested within each other, we want to go ahead and populate a gallery as we see here. So projector 1, projector 3, date 2010 or 210, 11 through 216. So now that we see what it is we're going to build, let's go jump to the code and go ahead and put this together so we can see our loops in action. So we see here we have our Power App, and I want to go over kind of what we have put together to work with and some of our, establishing information and data that we're going to build upon. So as we saw in the demo, we have just 2 date pickers, one for the start and the end date, nothing special about those. And we have a combo box for our multiple items, and we have a collection called call equipment. And if we go to our app on start, we'll see how we establish that and how we set up some of the data going forward. So we see here in our app on start, for this demo, we need to look at these last 3 lines here. So I had mentioned that the drop down is being fed by a collection, and we can see here is our establishing of that collection. Call equipment is coming from our equipment list, which again is right here. And below that, we are establishing another collection. Now, since we're feeding this into a gallery, we're going to use a collection to store our information. And in order to set up the gallery before runtime, since our data won't be populated until runtime, I went ahead and created an example element within this collection. This way, I can set this up, run my on start, and then go populate the gallery with these fields. The aforementioned gallery is here. Again, our items is call options, which is what we're going to populate. And if we look at our individual items, we see here I have one for the date and one for the item name. Because we put that in our app on start, we can go ahead and assign those values space within the gallery as we work out other elements within our application. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, this application, it's not going to do a whole lot, right? Because all we want to do is stop when we populate the gallery. That's it. We're not going to build this out so we actually make reservations. We just want to go ahead and show how the data is modeled so that we can take this and then truly build out more production-worthy applications. Because we're so simple, we're going to cram all of the functionality in one button. That's all we need. We have one screen, and we're going to have one button to process it, but this will allow us to see how all of the data is put together without having to jump back and forth between screens or look at code on different elements. So here is our on select of our search button. Well, the first thing we have to do is capture our start and end date. And that is going to be that start date dot selected date. And we are going to do the same for the end date. And we're going to store those into variables. Okay, next, because we could hit this button multiple times, we want to make sure we clear our collection each time we hit search. So as we change our parameters, our gallery is not overstuffed with old data. And now we're going to jump right into our loops. So in languages like JavaScript, C#, we have for loops with essentially, we'll do the JavaScript, I is less than some value, iterate, and go forward, right? So we've seen this before. We know this. Well, Power Apps doesn't have that. Of course not. What Power Apps has is a function called for all. And what it will do is, much like for each in PowerShell, it will loop through an object collection or series of things in Power Apps. What we want to do is utilize that to go through some of the ranges that we have. And what are our two ranges? We have two dates, start and end date, and we have a collection of items in a combo box. So those are going to be what we're going to target. But of course, you could take these concepts and apply it to any range of objects or items or elements within Power Apps that you want, even a collection. So we have our start date, we have our end date, of course, but we need to look into, well, how do we know the difference between those two dates, right? And, for all start, we are going to utilize a function called Diff, and much as the function sounds, it is the difference of a date. But that gives us an error. Why? Because diff gives us an integer of the difference of days between two dates. That's not a range. So we're going to expand that out, and we are going to use another function called sequence. And what sequence does is takes, well, hold on, starting at 1 and going through a value that is entered into it, in this case, the number of days between two dates, it creates a series of integers. So here we are saying we have a sequence from 1 to however many days difference that is. So that will give us our first iterator within our for all. So as noted in the title, we're iterating over two different nested for loops. So what we need to do next is do a second for all, and this time we need to get our combo box. So we have cell items dot selected items. Okay, so this is what our choice was from that. So because that is its own series, so all we have to do is use the elements that are within selected items to allow for all to iterate. From here, we now add our action. So what are we going to do? The whole point of this is to populate a collection. So of course, we have to collect within call options something. We know our two, we have an item name and an item date. So as placeholders, we do that. And let's see, we have to close collect. What have I missed? Helps to find the commas. Okay, so now that we've eliminated our date problem, we see here for all sequence over two dates, and then within that, for all for each selected item, we are going to collect within call options an item and a date. So now we just have to set values. Now from here, the fields are accessible from what our iterators are. So from here, the data within our sequences are available. So we have to reference those and add them to our collection. But the problem we have is for all does come with a record. And that is noted by the this record object. Well, that's great if you have one loop, but we have two and they both use the term this record. So you get a little confused trying to use the data if you have to duplicate the same terminology within two nested loops. So what we need to do next is give an alias to our particular iterators. And we do that with the as function. So what we see with as, for anybody who is familiar with SQL queries, this is giving an alias much the same as we would give an alias to a table to help with our joins if the column names are shared. Exact same premise here. So what we're saying is the record that comes from this sequence we will have listed as date counter, and the record that comes from this sequence will be listed as equipment counter. Okay, you can name them whatever you want. I'm using counter as my way to know that this is an internal iterator. You can use whatever you like to. Now, equipment counter is an addressable item, and we need our title and our item date. So we can do date counter dot value. But this isn't going to give us what we want. And let's see what happens when we go. Let's see what happens when we go. We start. We go ahead and choose some items. We'll go ahead and leave our default dates from the 11th to the 16th and hit search. And we have numbers. Why do we have numbers? Because our sequence gives us integers. It has no idea that we are operating over dates. Date diff returns an integer. So for all this cares, we are counting from 1 to whatever it was, 5. So what we have to do then is take this value and we need to date add from our start date using that iterator. So we're going to date add starting with var start date. We're going to add whatever our iterator value is, and that we will tell it is in days. So now we are adding a date value to our item date column, which is what we want. We hit play now, exact same fields, and you see here we have our dates. But we're not starting at the right date. Our sequence function starts at 1. So naturally, if we are in our search button in our loop, we see here we are adding in var start date starting at 1. So it's always going to be the next date. We just simply need to come in, do our counter, and bump our loop back by 1. Oops. Not our date, but our value back by 1. Again, we hit search. We have the 11th, but whoops, we have the 15th. What our problem now is the date difference between the start and the end date does not count a less than or equal to, but is rather just a less than state. So we would just have to come in here, do a +1 to make sure we bring in our end date. Now if we hit search, boom, 11 through 16, iterating over projectors 1 and 2. We can, of course, change this to 11 to 13, search, 11, 12, 13, projectors 1 and 3. So there we have it. Our nested loops with aliases to help us make what amounts to a multi-dimensional array, but in a collection that we can use. So this data is variable, generated in runtime, but happens to provide us with the structure we need to fill a collection and allow us to iterate over multiple variables. You could, of course, you can nest this as often as you want. You can go 3, 4, 5 down. Power Apps isn't going to stop you. I hope this helped. I look forward to any comments about different ways to put this together, but I hope this at least gives you a basis for going forward of how to translate your nested for loops that you have in code into Power Apps. Thanks, guys. See you next time.